Hello, Professor Stephen Shoemaker. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here with you today.
We have connected many times in the past, and so many people have asked me to have you on exploring the Quran and the Bible. So this is great. I'm just delighted that you're here. We're going to speak about your recent 2022 book, Creating the Quran, a Historical Critical Study, which has raised a lot of questions, gathered a lot of interest. I've seen a lot of responses on Twitter and on the internet, and I think a lot of people are eager to see how you would respond to some of those responses. I'm going to start with a brief introduction, and then we'll get into some of the challenges that you raise in the book and some of the controversies in Quranic studies. So, everyone, Stephen Shoemaker is a professor at the University of Oregon, an Ira Gaston Fellow in Christian Studies. He's a historian of religion in the late ancient Near East. He is the author of, among many works, and he's a really prolific author, a very thought-provoking book entitled A Prophet Has Appeared, The Rise of Islam Through Christian and Jewish Eyes. That was in 2021. And I think that's your source book that is very useful for courses, for assigning for your courses, but also through the presentation of early texts and the commentary helps us think about our paradigm for understanding early Islam. He's also the author of an earlier work in 2011, The Death of a Prophet, the End of Muhammad's Life and the Beginnings of Islam, which has been a lot of commentary on that book because of the possibility suggested by some of these sources that Muhammad was alive during the early conquests. And then finally, and most important for us, Creating the Quran, Historical Critical Study, just published in 2022 by the University of California Press. Is that okay as an introduction? Would you add or subtract anything?
Nope, that's fine. Better than I deserve.
Okay, great. Well, let's get right into some of the important questions about Quranic studies. I want to speak first about the field generally, and then we're going to get into carbon dating. So if anyone is really interested in carbon dating, hold on, keep watching. But at first, I'd like to get your assessment of the field of early Islam, Quranic studies. You're someone who knows at least two fields because you work also in early Christian studies. I think you speak in Creating the Quran of the field of Islamic studies as protectionist. We were speaking before this recording of, I think Guillaume D has used this term as well. So could you assess the field generally? What is distinctive or unique about early Islamic studies, and what do you mean by protectionist?
Big question. I hope I can give an adequate answer. Well, I don't know that I would say that the entire field of Islamic studies is protectionist, but there are strong protectionist tendencies within the field. This is a concept from the academic study of religion that's not something Guillaume or I identified, invented, sorry, I should say, particularly to identify something that's going on in early Islamic studies. Wayne Proudfoot in particular is a theorist who's talked a lot about this, and it refers to the way that scholars often are determined to protect the traditions that they are studying from critical analysis, and a critical analysis which brings into question the accuracy or the historicity of some of these questions. It's a very common tendency in certain quarters of religious studies. It's been a big part of Islamic studies, particularly coming out of the McGill School and the sort of perennialist emphasis there, where what you really are interested in is the eternal truths of these things, and you don't want to say anything that's offensive to the modern community. What you write should be something that could be acceptable to them. These are all kind of protectionist impulses. I think some scholars might have them overtly. Actually, I'm pretty confident that some of them do, even non-Muslims. I've encountered that. I think in other cases, they're just sort of inchoate in the field. They're also given a certain kind of fuel by a kind of cultural moment that we're having, particularly in North America, particularly in the United States, where you're not allowed to criticize anything about a religion or about someone else's religion, or especially Islam. I mean, I think most immediately of this fiasco we've seen at Hamline University, right? I mean, that's a very good example of a protectionist discourse.
Yeah, so just introduce that briefly. I mean, there was an adjunct professor who was criticized and ultimately relieved of her post. Whether she was fired or not has been disputed, but she showed to her students an image of the Prophet Muhammad, an Islamic image of the Prophet Muhammad that was meant to sort of give honor to him, but was there were complaints, accusations of Islamophobia, etc.
In an art history class, I don't know if you mentioned that. If you did, I bring it for emphasis that it was studying the history of art that this was done. So yes, but let's not get too far down that rabbit hole. But I think that's a pretty good example of some of the protectionist impulses. That, of course, is one beyond, that's an example of it beyond the academy, beyond any particular academic discourse, but it filters into what happens in the academy. So I'm trying to think, what did I answer that? Was there more to the question?
Yeah, that was really good. And I mean, I just wonder, for someone who would want to defend this sort of vibe in early Islamic studies, which is, someone might grant that, okay, it is protectionist, but I mean, that's fine. We shouldn't offend people who have religious sensibilities. And so, like, why would you have to do something that challenges traditional claims, or why do you have to get to the historicity? I mean, I can probably anticipate your answer, but do you want to say anything about that? Like, how do you see the vocation of an academic scholar working in these things? You know, is it in part to provoke or to undermine traditional views, to disabuse people of their naive notions about religion? Yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yes, thoughts on that. I mean, you don't have to study religion this way. That's a point I try to make in every one of these books, that is doing this radically critical study of the historical tradition. You know, there are a whole lot of ways to look at this. You know, there are a whole lot of ways to look at the history of the memories that come out of the earliest centuries of Islam. One can look at them from a perspective of faith, which a pious Muslim does, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what that does not compare to is the kind of academic study of something from a scientific basis, scientific in this sort of European sense of this, right? Wissenschaft or French science, right? Not like hard sciences, but what we always are translating as studies. We're studying something critically as an object of study, right? It's not something we're subjectively interested in. We might be subjectively interested in it sometimes, but when we come to it in the context of the academy, it's an object of study, and we want to try to look at it just like anything else. We want to look at the Quran, bringing the same questions, the same suppositions, the same hardcore doubts that we would about any ancient text, right? So, I mean, I think this is all grounded in a hermeneutics of skepticism that has characterized the Western humanities since the 19th century. And it's certainly been a part of religious studies and biblical studies. And one way to put it is, to me, it's very important, if we're going to have a discipline of religious studies, and we're going to build it around this kind of skeptical, critical approach to a tradition, we have to do it to all traditions equally, right? You can't do it to some and not do it to others. So, I mean, if we're going to do, take that approach to religious studies, that the sort of your caricature of a Quran person, or I don't know what the right word is, your person who says, why do we have to do this? Well, then in a biblical studies class, I mean, we shouldn't be reading Bart Ehrman. We should be reading Pope Benedict, right? And his biography of Jesus. But I hope people can see that, Pope Benedict, a provost of the University of Regensburg, I mean, a real scholar of theology, what he's doing is something different from what would go on in a critical study of religion that's grounded in the principles of the Enlightenment at a secular institution like the one I'm at. That's a whole nother sort of thing, right? I mean, we can't really advance a particular religious point of view, so we have to find another way to analyze religious culture on a ground that can be shared across a classroom, across a campus, right? And so I think that's why this critical approach is important. It's not the only approach.
Right.
You don't have to do it. I tell my students all the time, no one's making you take this class. No one's making you read this book. I'll read my book.
Yes, everyone, read Professor Shoemaker's book. Okay, so let's get into some of the academic debates over the actual evidence, sort of shifting now from whether you should do the historical critical work to when you do the historical critical work, what does that look like in regard to the study of the Quran? And I'd like to just get right to maybe the most contentious issue, and maybe, I don't know, the issue that's had the most attention in controversies over the Quran recently, and that's carbon dating of Quran manuscripts. So, I mean, many viewers will be familiar that there's been a lot of attention to recent carbon dating of Quran manuscripts. Earlier guests on this podcast channel's YouTube channel have spoken about this and sort of defended the reliability of these tests when they're analyzed properly. And I'd just like to read a passage. This is a passage from Nikolai Sinai's The Quran, a Historical Critical Introduction, just to get some dates out there which give us a perspective on recent testing of Quran manuscripts. So he writes, the testing of a folio belonging to a very substantial Quranic palimpsest, and we could speak about what a palimpsest is, discovered in the Grand Mosque of Sana'a in Yemen, has produced a likelihood of more than 95% that the parchment is older than 660 CE or AD. Other tests have yielded a 95% probability of the parchment of early manuscripts having been manufactured at some time between 649 and 675, or 606 and 652, or 568 and 645. And those last dates, 568 to 645, are for a fragment much celebrated, at least the dating was much celebrated, kept at Birmingham in the UK. He continues, although the radiocarbon dating of Quranic manuscript has produced occasional anomalies, you might want to speak about those because you mentioned them in the book, the increasing number of such tests would appear to confirm that a very considerable portion of Quranic text was around, albeit not with variants, by the 650s. Okay, that's a lot, and maybe I shouldn't have read so much, and I know there's a lot to say about it, but where would you begin in responding?
I would commend you for bringing this point right to the front. And indeed, there's a reason it's the third chapter in creating the Quran. The first two chapters deal with the literary evidence, which honestly, one of the arguments for the Quranic date around 650 is that supposedly the Islamic tradition is unanimous in ascribing this text to Uthman. Well, it's not. That's something that's falsifiable. And I've done that, particularly in the first chapter. And once I got that out of the way, it seemed, yeah, the really big elephant in the room has been the radiocarbon dating. And unfortunately, in the past decade or so, I think it's been used to shut down a lot of critical reflection on the Quran and its history, and without good reason. The first radiocarbon datings of the so-called Stanford folio, which I must emphasize was stolen and should not be published and should not be written about. It was illegally obtained from the collection in Yemen. And this is something we don't want to have anything to do with. But the results of that first came back right as Death of a Prophet came out. And I was like, well, interesting. Let me think, does that change a lot? No, it really didn't change much at Death of the Prophet. I can still, pretty much everything I said in there, I'd still stand by. But my initial response was to say, yeah, okay, science has spoken. And I think that's been the response a lot of other people had. And well, as a lot more data began to come out, more radiocarbon datings were published, I began talking more with people who knew some more about this, and and other people in medieval studies who are like, yeah, well, we like radiocarbon dating, but we don't tend to think it can date something so precisely as that. It's a great method, but it has its limits. And I became increasingly convinced that it was being misused. It was being evidence from scientific experiments, like any other evidence, has to be interpreted. And yeah, we could talk a lot about that and how the radiocarbon dating measurements have to be interpreted and what are the ins and outs of that. But they have to be interpreted, and the interpretation changes as our data set changes. And this is why I don't think we can commit too much to saying, aha, we got it, 650. What do we have? We have some old manuscripts. We have manuscripts that I'm pretty confident to say, sure, this is from somewhere maybe in the later 7th century, maybe the middle of the 7th century. Some of them from the early 8th century, it seems. This is the kind of thing we can say, this is a really old Quranic manuscript. Can we say it's 95% from 650? No, I really don't think that. But there are a lot of moving pieces going on here. I mean, first thing, you know this, you've written about this. The same object has been dated 4 different times with 4 different dates, right? Pretty much any time we've dated the same object twice, 4 times, we've come back with pretty different dates. This is a problem. As I explain in my book, right? One of the principles of the scientific method is an experiment is supposed to be repeatable, right? You do the same thing, you get the same result. You do the same thing, you get the same result. And we're not close to that at this moment, at least.
So you mean, Stephen, the folios from the Sena palimpsest, or the manuscripts found at the early Quran manuscripts found in Sena?
Yes and no. I mean, there's the famous Sena palimpsest, but there are other manuscripts from Sena that have been radiocarbon dating. I have in the book, I have all of the radiocarbon datings that have been published to my knowledge up until this point. But so, for instance, there's another set of folios from 2 different manuscripts in Sena, 3 from one manuscript, 2 from the other. All were radiocarbon dated. Each of those folios was dated in 2 different labs, one the Lyon lab, the other in the Zurich lab. And there are some different dates for these individual folios, within a single manuscript. And then there's the question of, how do you calibrate the date? And I have this in a nice chart in my book. I have a lot of charts of these dates for handy reference if you want to get a handle on a lot of these numbers flying around. And I'm not selling my book. It's free, by the way. It's open access, so go take a look. But there's a calibration curve that was published in 2013 that was used to determine a date for radiocarbon measurements. And now we had a new one that was just published, Intercal 20. It was published at the end of 2020. And so I've recalibrated all of the data. You can do this with, you get a little software program, you can recalibrate. Anyone can, and I have all of the raw data. I watched an earlier, one of your podcasts I watched recently was Sidki's podcast, because I know he was talking about this. And he was saying that he couldn't talk about certain manuscripts because he didn't have the raw data. Well, I've got it. I don't know why he couldn't get it. It's in these online databases. You do need to know French to be able to navigate them, but it's all in there. And I've reproduced all of the data. The only thing we don't know about is there are these datings that Fred Donner has done that have also questioned the method that he hasn't published yet. And I've reported on them with his permission in there. But in any case, yeah, the numbers can be all over the place. I mean, what do you make of a manuscript that has one folio that dates sometime between 433 and 599 CE, and another one that dates 388 to 535 CE, but then, and that folio dates in a different lab to 590 to 650 CE. I mean, we're talking the same object, 2 different labs. We have dates centuries apart.
Well, but people, I think even, I think Saldiki maybe has written somewhere that there must have been in the Lyon lab and maybe the Zurich lab, there must have been contamination, and that explains it. And the testing that obtained the dates that are closer to the traditional date for Uthman's codification, those are the ones that were more reliable.
That sounds protectionist, right? And it's special pleading. I mean, to my knowledge, no one has published any evidence suggesting that this was contaminated. And I think it's kind of, I don't know, I have more respect for French and Swiss scientists than that. I think they're competent. I don't see any reason to just categorically dismiss the results they get just because we like others better. I mean, I know I also saw in Sidki's talk, he used this, he says basically this is noise and we can filter it all out. Well, fine, show me. It's one thing to say that. It's another thing to deploy a method and show how that's the case, and how we could all sit down with the same method and come to the same conclusion independently. I've not seen anything like that yet. And I would further add, I think all we're seeing is noise at this point, right?
The early dates are curious, and you're right. I have written about this question of the early dates. I mean, even Birmingham, which has a date range of 568 to 645. Well, it's supposed to be an Uthmanic text type, but Uthman, I mean, that his work is at least traditionally dated would have been around 650, not at the very end, but actually after the very end of that date range. So that does raise some questions, the early dates that have been given.
And if you look at that Birmingham Codex, it looks later, right? And I would recommend to anyone who is interested in this question and interested in that manuscript, they should go read Alba Fideli's dissertation on this, which is also available free online. That's how I found it. And I think she makes a very compelling case why radiocarbon dating is important, but why it's not the only thing we should have in our toolkit.
That's an interesting point.
Right. And we can use it. Well, this is how almost any archaeologist would use it, almost any medieval historian. It's not our only thing. We don't rely on it alone. It's one tool in our kit. And we have to consider along all of the other kinds of evidence that we have. But I'll go back to this example that was in Sitke's podcast. Just like when you take a thermometer and you put it in your mouth and you get 98. And you're like, well, that can't be right. And you put it back in, and then you get 98.6, 98.6, 98.6. Well, what I'm seeing in the data here is a 98, a 94, 101, a 97. I just don't see anything that is sort of a consistent pattern that we might say, well, that's just noise. To me, I just see things scattered all over the place. And you see folios in the same manuscript of widely divergent dates. And here I want to call out another problem that I call out in the book, and this is with the Corpus Quranicum project. They're dating the tubing in manuscript. So they took 3 radiocarbon measurements for 3 different folios. And what they did is they averaged them together, and then they took that one average measurement and calculated the date of the whole manuscript based on that. That's a problem, right? When you take the individual date of the latest folio in that manuscript, and you take the radiocarbon dating for that and you're looking at something that's actually like sometime from the very end of the 8th century, so from the very end of the 7th century into the beginnings of the 8th century. So here's the thing. This leaves us with 2 important conclusions. One is that manuscript can't be any older, right, than this most recent part of it. It might have older parts, but it can't be, if we have a folio that's from 780, say, the manuscript can't be earlier than 780. And averaging to get a result you like that makes it earlier, that's really fudging the data, in my opinion. But the other thing that this manuscript shows us, if we take these folios individually and we assume that their different datings are correct, well, what we're looking at here in this manuscript is a single manuscript where folios of varying dates have been put together in one manuscript. Right? So we really can't know the age of a particular manuscript until we've dated every folio.
Every folio. Okay.
This is a huge problem. We're not nearly done with this yet.
Yeah, so interesting point that I would just encourage everyone to keep in mind about dating, which is as Professor Shoemaker is saying, a response to those who would say, well, carbon dating says this, is potentially, well, but carbon dating must be checked or controlled by paleography, that is the study of the script in particular, but also codicology. So other features of the parchment or the binding and those sorts of things. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, but I want to ask about, so I want to take this and try to put it into context of early Islamic history, which is usually what is done. Even certain studies that have been on carbon dating are pretty quick to then compare their results with the traditional narrative or with the traditional narratives of the codification of the Quran, which, as many of our viewers will know, the traditional report is that there was one, there's certain stories which involve Abu Bakr, the first caliph, reigns from 632 to 634, bringing together the Quran on writing, on suhuf, on individual sheets. But the principal work to bring the Quran together into one mushaf, one codex, is that of Uthman, the third caliph, who reigns from 644 to 656, at least according to traditional dates. Now, okay, so I want to assess this claim, the Uthmanic claim, and bring in some other evidence that you raised in the book Creating the Quran, because there could be other arguments for Uthman. Now, you've already mentioned the beginning, the first 2 chapters, you deal with some of the traditional arguments that the Islamic sources attribute this to Uthman, therefore it is likely by Uthman. At least one argument that you address is the uniformity of the Quranic text, at least with the exception of the Sana palimpsest. The basic Quranic consonantal text is remarkably uniform across the manuscripts. So, I mean, doesn't that make it likely that there would be the project of one caliph who destroyed variant versions, just like we read about in the stories about Uthman?
Yes, I think that's true. But that caliph was not Uthman. The caliph was Abdul Malik.
What are some of the points that would lead us to Abdul Malik and away from Uthman?
Well, I mean, to really answer that question, it takes, quite
Some
a bit
more
of,
episodes.
what's that?
A few more episodes.
Well, or a book. And to get really the full answer, I'd look at the first 2 chapters of the book, where it's laid out in some painstaking detail. I mean, the truth of the matter is this attribution to Uthman is not uniform. There are all kinds of other people the first Quran is attributed to. The story of Uthman as we have it is really a creation of Bukhari, who canonizes it, and he places it in, a hadith collection, which gives it a kind of religious authority, at least for Sunnis, and then it becomes the received narrative, and all of these other ones are just left to the side. Now, speaking of Sunnis, one of the things I highlight in my book, building on the exceptional work of our good friend, mutually, I think, Ali Amir Moezi, he has done the excellent work of showing us actually the early Shias have a very, very, very different story to tell about the early history of the Quran, and one that's, I think, not only neglected, but it's disparaged often. And I mean, if you go look at Noldeke and that big, massive volume, it's just the Shi'is are lumped in with the Christian polemicists in terms of the worth of their views on the formation of the Quran. That's unacceptable. Really, that's unacceptable. We need to do better than that. There's a lot of noise around who was the first person to collect the Quran. We look outside of the Hadith collections. We look to the historians, which I do in the book, following up. And here's another name everyone should know: the great work of Alfred de Primar. One of my big beefs with scholarship on the Quran in North America and Germany is they are not reading French scholarship. Just go look at a random bibliography and see how much see how much Guillaume D is in there, right? See how much de Primar is in there. See how much Gilliot is in there. They're not reading these scholars, and I think that some of the best scholarship out there. So, and de Primar, I think, was the greatest scholar of the Quran in the 20th century. And a lot of the information I'm taking there is from having read his studies, where he goes through the early historians and says, well, let's look aside from, sources about the Quran, sources about Hadith. Let's look at what the early historians are saying. Sometimes they don't mention anything about Uthman having anything to do with the Quran. How is that possible if it's like well known to everyone that Uthman did this? Another issue we were talking a little bit about this before. Could Uthman have even possibly done this? Did he have a state apparatus? This is a point, I'm doing a lot of name dropping here, but hey, a lot of what I've done is not my own stuff. I'm building on the work of a lot of other colleagues who've done exceptional work in trying to do critical research, yourself included, I might add. Boy, don't let me forget to say that. To sort of build up a critical account of the Quran. Guillaume D has some excellent stuff in French in his Quran des Historiens about what it takes to canonize a text. It takes to make a text standard across an entire empire. It takes a pretty impressive state apparatus that can enforce
your
that.
contention is that that state apparatus did not exist in the time of Uthman, but did exist in the time of Abdul Malik.
My sense is that is a very widespread consensus among scholars studying the emergence of the early Islamic State. There is some thought that maybe around Muawiyah something is starting to come into view, but if there is, there's nothing like what we see with Abdul Malik. That is when we really have a very powerful state, a state that could do something like enforce a canonical Quran. And we have accounts of them doing this. We even have an account that tells us how much they compensated someone when they stole their Quran and confiscated it and destroyed it. But this is another thing with why I think we need to give a lot more credibility to the account of Abdul Malik. there is a very widespread account that Abdul Malik and his functionaries did a lot to edit the Quran. This is not really up for any debate. That is in the tradition. Question is, what did they do? Right? Well, so those who say, oh, well, the Quran was already in place, oh, well, he added a couple diacritical marks. Oh, maybe there were some vowels put in.
So you're referring to the work of Hajjaj and the so-called Second Masahif project.
Correct, that exactly. So this is pretty universally attested, although second I might dispute, right? A couple points with this. One is, this is confirmed in the external sources, some of which are near contemporary with this activity. And what these Christian sources admittedly are telling us is that this is when the Quran was standardized. So that, think what you will about external sources, but it's significant that we have a convergence of what's coming out of the Islamic tradition, what's coming in other traditions there. And then there's also the work, I'm forgetting, the great French manuscript specialist, Desroches. He says this can't be what's going on with this project of Hajjaz and Abdul Malik, because actually the manuscripts aren't consistent with that assumption that that's what's happened, because we see some of those things before that time in the manuscripts, we see some of those things after that time in the manuscripts. So I think if what you're looking for is what there's a consensus on, then it's Abdul Malik.
Okay. Well, there's more evidence you bring forth in the book, which calls into question some of our assumptions about how the Quran came to be. And I want to turn to some of that, including the question of whether pre-Islamic Arabia was a literate culture. I forget now if you use the term literate or literary, but maybe you can explain that if there's any difference there. But I mean, the heart of the matter is, was pre-Islamic Arabia and early Islamic Arabia, so, the early 7th century, was it the kind of culture that could have produced a written scripture? So I want to sort of push you a little bit on this, just by noting that we have all sorts of inscriptions now that Ahmad Jalad and many others have worked on, which suggests that people were writing things. And as you know, the Arabic script, which develops out of Nabatean, does exist. We have inscriptions in places like Syria and Zebed and other places, and more recently found close to and in the Hijaz, pre-Islamic inscriptions in the Arabic script. So, I mean, doesn't this suggest at least literacy, but maybe a literate culture? How would you push back against that?
I wouldn't so much push back on it as I would just refer to what is the status quaestionis on this from the main experts in the field. This was one of the great discoveries of me writing the book. I didn't really know about this until I started researching the project. But one of the things I wanted to do was, one of the things I've known as someone who's an expert in late ancient Christianity is there's no evidence for Christianity anywhere near Mecca and Medina. It's startling that we don't have this evidence, right? We have evidence everywhere else. Is it possible this is just, happenstance? Of course it is. But it's significant at the same time that we just don't see this when we see it everywhere else. So, because I'm trying to think, well, okay, what exactly is the cultural status of late ancient Mecca, Medina, the central Hijaz there? And of course, the older narrative was, well, the state was not much, right? There wasn't a whole lot going on there. And now there's been this move towards seeing the Quran as a really sophisticated document, really sophisticated piece of literature that is engaging with a lot of the religious and cultural traditions of late antiquity. A guy named Gabriel Reynolds wrote a book on this that was really good. And I applaud this move, and I think it's largely correct that the Quran is, in fact, it seems to be such a text. But then the question is, well, how do we get that kind of a text that's so drenched in Christian culture, that demands that its audience knows a lot about Christian culture already? How does that sort of a text work in Hijaz? So I'm looking at the latest scholarship on history of Arabic language, and particularly history of Arabic language in this time and place. So I'm looking at Michael McDonald, I'm looking at Christian Robin, I'm looking at Peter Stein, and there's a consensus from them. They all say that in this time, Muhammad's Arabia was, for all intents and purposes, non-literate. Now, Mike McDonald is the best guy to read on this by far, I think. And I think he's also, I think he would be considered the real expert on these matters. Again, I didn't figure this out. I just read McDonald and then decided, hey, well, we should be thinking about the Quran in light of what these historical linguists are thinking about the history of the Arabic language in this time, right? Publishing inscriptions, finding inscriptions is another thing. McDonald, of course, knows these inscriptions too. His conclusion is through a comparative study of a lot of non-literate cultures in more recent history, that it is not that uncommon to have the existence of writing in a culture that is non-literate. Now, that might sound like, that's ridiculous. That's doublespeak. What are you talking about, Shoemaker? Well, what he says is a culture can have writing and still be non-literate if it's not using writing for the most important cultural activities, for its religious culture, for literary culture, for conducting political activities, for conducting economic activities. And there are cultures we know of today that have a writing system, but they are non-literate in how they function. And they use their writing system mostly as a form of recreation. This is, again, McDonald, not me. This is the expert. And indeed, he looks at all of these inscriptions that we're finding in the deserts primarily, not in Mecca and Medina, right? As the scrawlings of kind of lonely shepherds in the desert who are just writing something, to kind of pass the time. It's a lot of, as I said in my book, Kilroy was here, or Van Halen rules, or this is a dog, I drew it, Stephen, right? That's again, I'm just repeating McDonald here on this.
Right.
So taking him at his word, if these are non-literate cultures that aren't using written language for their religious culture, their other sorts of culture, I don't see how it's possible that they could have received in Mecca and Medina the richness of late ancient religious culture that seems to inform the Quran. B, I don't think there would be an audience there that could have received it. And C, how could they have written down the Quran when they didn't have literacy?
So just to be really clear on this, I mean, the Quran has material in it which reflects pretty closely literature that was circulating in the late antique Near East. So some examples I think that you mentioned are, for example, the story of Alexander, who in the Quran is Dhul Qarnayn, although some people would deny that, or the story of the sleepers of Ephesus, both of those accounts in Quran 18, but material on Jesus and other biblical prophets as well, some of which is found in the canonical Bible, other elements of which are not. So, I mean, you're saying that this sort of engagement with literary traditions would more likely take place in a literate culture, but someone might push back and say, well, I mean, you just need a storyteller. You just need, I don't know, like old Orientalists would say, or like Tor André, the Swedish scholar, speculates that, Muhammad was in a fair and there were probably traveling missionaries there who just showed up and started telling stories. I'm kind of paraphrasing and not doing justice to a good scholar. But I mean, what if someone said, they're just storytellers. You don't actually need a literate culture to receive and then comment on, reproduce this material.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sort of the old Deus ex machina of oral tradition that has routinely been invoked, and I just don't think it is sufficient in this case. The Quran seems to show a level of sophistication and in some instances precision that is beyond what we generally would find from oral tradition. So, I mean, but in any case, even if there are these storytellers, where are they getting their stories? Right? I don't see any evidence of a Christian community, anyone there. There's no evidence of a Jewish community in Mecca. right? What do you do with all the Jewish lore that's in the so-called Meccan surahs? Though I know you, like me, don't particularly place a lot of stock in that strict chronology, or at least that's the way it was the last time we talked. Who knows? I mean, our opinions change on this. That's the other thing. If I get new evidence, I'll change my mind on a lot of these opinions. I'm more than willing to do so,
Right.
especially on this question about the state of culture. But with no Christians down there, and you bring up the Bible, there's all this biblical tradition in there. Was the Bible in Arabic already at this time?
Well, I don't think so.
Right. Right. So where are they getting this? They don't have they're not literate. There's no Bible even in Arabic. How are they getting all of this big dose of biblical, extra biblical Jewish Christian culture? Some of it, yeah. I mean, I still allow that some of the Quran may go back to Muhammad, may come from there, but I don't think we can explain all of the Quran that way. I don't think we can explain the Alexander traditions as just someone heard a story and told it. Some of our friends have argued pretty convincingly, I think, that this clearly shows it's copying a literary source. And you want to talk about the Kathisma. Should we do it now?
Yes, we should. I just want to bring up one point related to Alexander, but right, all of like the vibe and our momentum is sort of bringing this conversation to Palestine, Syria. So we've got to speak about the Kathisma. But just to mention about Alexander, so as I said a little bit ago, Quran 18 has this character, Dhul Qarnayn, and scholars like Kevin Van Bledo and Tommaso Tazzei and others have argued that there is a direct literary connection to one particular Syriac work known as the Neshana. And they would back you up on your last point that this sort of correspondence we're seeing here reflects a direct connection of these two texts. Not that the Quran is copying the text. Quran is in Arabic. These texts are in Syriac, but something that is precise enough to connect these two texts and not vague tradition. So let me just leave it at that. Okay, Kathisma. Now, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because what we're sort of getting at is this idea that there's a biblical, especially Christian thing going on in the Quran's context. You're arguing that Mecca and Medina don't have signs of Christianity. I'm a little more skeptical on that, but that's okay. Let's set that aside for now. So that could suggest that some of the material in the Quran originates not in Arabia, but further north. And you were the scholar who brought to the world's attention one possible case of this, which is the fact that the Quranic story of Jesus's birth in Surah 19, Surah Maryam, involves the miracle of the palm tree. So where the baby Jesus speaks miraculously and calls down a palm tree to lower itself and give fruit to his mother. And I should let you take it from here. So what's the connection between that story and this one church in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, called the Kathisma?
Right. And it also gives some serious credit to my very good friend, colleague, and frequent collaborator, Guillaume D., who's also worked on these traditions and has developed them. I think developed my initial insight into an even stronger argument for connecting the Quranic passage with this particular holy site in Jerusalem. Actually, this was a point that connected some of my early work on early Christian devotion to Mary. And another thing I work on is liturgy in Jerusalem. That's what I'm actually working on currently at the moment, is hymnography from late 6th century Jerusalem, which we actually have, believe it or not. It's amazing. But this Kathisma church, it was probably, I'm going to be careful here because I could really go into a deep dive here. We're already getting short in the hour. Let's just say exactly as Gabriel said. There is this peculiar configuration of certain Christian traditions about the nativity of Jesus that are always separate, that really have very little to do with each other, but through a very peculiar happenstance of the history of this shrine, of the history of the Jerusalem liturgy, they are brought together at this church along the side of the road in a remote location halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. which was probably, I think, the original nativity shrine in the Jerusalem area, but that's another rabbit hole. Partly these traditions became attached to it because the nativity was moved to Bethlehem. They had to find a new significance for this nativity shrine. And lo and behold, this configuration of extra biblical traditions about the birth of Jesus looks almost exactly like what we find in the Quranic nativity account, right? It's these same peculiar traditions that have come together. Now, before identifying this shrine, we would have said maybe, well, maybe just whoever was writing this passage of the Quran happened to know this tradition and throw it together. But now we can say, actually, we can look at a site connected with the nativity of Jesus in Jerusalem that has this exact configuration of traditions. One of the things Guillaume discovered was the readings that go with this shrine, the liturgical readings, map perfectly onto this part of the Quranic story where, if I'm remembering correctly, that Abraham is Mary's brother, or vice versa. She's the sister of Abraham. Remembering this correctly?
Of Aaron.
Aaron, sorry, thank you. That's what I knew something was wrong with me. Actually, the readings for this shrine perfectly explain that passage, right? If this whole complex is coming from there, something like we find in the Quran looks like exactly what's going on at that shrine. We also know the archaeologists have determined this shrine was the model architecturally for the Dome of the Rock. So it obviously was something pretty important for Muhammad's earlier.
That's a really important point. Yeah, people should.
But it also was converted into a mosque by the early 6th century, and it's probably the earliest sacred shrine, Christian shrine, appropriated by the Muslims in Islamic Jerusalem, at least that I know of. So all of this just really comes together. And I'll finish with this. If we were dealing with a problem, say, relevant to the history of the New Testament, to a gospel, to something in Acts, and we found something in Greco-Roman past, something about a pagan shrine, everything came together and just mapped onto something from one of the stories about Paul in Acts, there would be no question. Everyone would say, obviously, that's coming from that cultural configuration there in the world that these documents were being written in. And then here's another extension of this, back to what we were talking about previously. I don't think this is something that a storyteller just walks down to Mecca and tells. This is a very specific tradition unique to this shrine. We don't find knowledge of this configuration anywhere else in the early Christian tradition. Nowhere else do these traditions come together. Nowhere else do they come together with a writing, with readings that can explain Mary as Aaron's sister. Nowhere do they come together in a building that was the architectural model for the Dome of the Rock that became the first Christian space appropriated by Muslims. I mean, are you getting sort of the stacking of if it were one of these things, two of these things, but five of these things, for me, it kind of starts to create a high probability that there's a connection here. And I don't think it's a connection that could have been made in Mecca.
So the passage that I referred to earlier that is connected here is when the infant Jesus, according to most readings, although there's an interesting dispute among exegetes or commentators here, this is Quran 19, Surat Maryam, verse 24. Thereupon he called her from below her, do not grieve. Your Lord has made a spring to flow at your feet. Shake the trunk of the palm tree. Freshly picked dates will drop upon you. And this is related to, this miracle is known from Christian texts. I think the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew. I think.
It's known in Pseudo Matthew, but it's actually known earlier in a book called The Book of Mary's Repose, which is one of the earliest, very lengthy account of the end of Mary's life. And it's a text we know was circulating in Palestine because we have Christian Palestinian Aramaic fragments of it, the date of the 6th century, monastery of Marsaba. All Christian Palestinian Aramaic comes from Greek, so we know this story was circulating in Palestine in the 5th and the 6th century.
Now, one last question about the Kathisma, and then we can move on to maybe a final topic, and then I'll leave you in peace. I have seen images of a mosaic of a palm tree from the Kathisma Church, which I think is no longer in situ, but has either been covered to protect it or it's been removed. I'm not sure. but I can't remember who sent it to me, but it's possible it was Guillaume, but I'm not sure. But the idea was that the presence of the palm tree there might reflect the associating of the spot with this very tradition of the Kathisma and the Quran. Do you know about this palm tree? Just thought I'd ask.
Of course, I know all about this palm tree.
Okay.
I've visited the site many times. I was just there most recently last March. And I do think it's still in situ, but it's covered and you can't see it. I went with the excavator Rena Abner when I was living in East Jerusalem in 1999-2000. And she gave me a personal tour of the site as it was just being excavated. And she showed me the mosaic at that time, so I've seen it. There are lots of pictures of it available that you can find. Yes, that is the thinking, that this connects it to the mosque. This is what I think when I was first writing on this back in 2001, 2002, in my book on the ancient Dormition traditions, the archaeologists thought that the mosaic was Byzantine, but we now know it's part of the conversion to a mosque.
Okay.
So it's an Islamic mosaic of a palm tree at this ancient nativity shrine. So we just added layer 7 on top, I think, right? I mean,
okay, terrific. All right, one last topic that I thought was just really fascinating in your book, Creating the Quran, which, by the way, yes, everyone should buy, but you said it's open access, is that right?
you didn't know that?
I don't know. Maybe I knew it and forgot, but it's still
it's free.
It's worth repeating. It's worth repeating.
It's free. It's free from Amazon as a Kindle. You can get it through the Cal website. It's on my academia page. I got a PDF posted there if you want it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I want to make this free to anyone in the world with an internet connection and a government that's not censoring what they can download.
Okay, let's speak about something that really I found fascinating. That is in a later chapter, but not the last chapter. I'm forgetting which chapter, but it's memory science.
Me too. My favorite part of the book.
You are the first person, I think, to introduce the community of Quranic studies scholars to this whole thing. I mean, I didn't even know this field existed. I probably should have, I guess, assumed that psychologists and sociologists would think about human capacities of memory and try to apply it to things from the humanities and etc. But the field does exist, and you say you show what it says about the capacities and the reliability of human memory, and you apply it to a certain extent to how this should shape our understanding the transmission of the Quran. I mean, I'd like to just touch on it here. I'd love to have you back a second time and really have a deep dive into some of the studies of memory science. I would commend everyone to read those chapters and to look at some of the examples, because it's better, I think, reading them, because there's very specific data over how much people can actually remember. And basically the answer is not very much.
Right.
But I wanted to just ask you a pointed question about this. So let's just say someone reads your book and sees this data, people give nonsense words, a list of nonsense words, and 10 minutes later go back to the subject of the test and say, okay, tell me nonsense words, and they've got no idea. They can't remember it. There are people, for example, Lord and Perry. I mean, you could do this better, but I'm just sort of going quickly here because I want to get to the pointed question. Lord and Perry, the famous sociologists, or I don't know how to describe them, anthropologists, I guess, who... sorry?
They were classicists, working
classicists. But they did field work to study the work of, I think, Yugoslavian at the time oral storytellers. And I think, like Perry, you show how Perry listened to one version of an oral tale, and then Lord comes back, unless I've got it mixed up and it's the other way around, doesn't really matter. Lord comes back, listens to the same tale, and it's totally different. It's much longer. And so you have all these anecdotal arguments for the problems of human memory. But I just want to ask this question. Okay, finally, after that too long of an introduction, people would say, one, okay, but it's different in Arabia in early Islamic times, because it was, as you would say, most people are not literate, and so the capacities of human memory in non-literate societies are higher. They just have amazing retention. Some people might even say, and this is kind of problematic, the Arabs themselves, culturally, or maybe they would say something else, have a remarkable capacity for memory. Okay, let me ask that, and then I'll follow up with another one. What would you say to that?
That is not true, at least if you believe science,
Okay.
right? We're all supposed to trust the science, right? That's what we learned during the pandemic. They've done scientific studies of these kinds of things. And time and again, it's just been shown false. And one of the most remarkable things to come out of memory studies was they've shown that actually memory improves with writing, right? People in literate cultures have better memories, better capacity for memories, partly because they can off-source some of that other stuff. This was an extraordinary finding for me in reading about this stuff. But yeah, before you get to your other question, let me just say, please read this chapter. This was my favorite chapter. This was my favorite chapter, I think, of anything I've ever done. I'm a sort of a restless scholar. I love learning about new stuff. I want every day, you know what, the reason I get out of bed, I want to go learn about something new. I want to figure out how to use what I learned new to see something from a new angle, right? That's why this is the greatest job in the world. And memory science was one of these things. When I'm looking at memory science, and I learned so much about myself. For me, I came out of this project having nothing to do with the Qur'an or the study of religion, simply from having learned how our memories work and how my memory worked, a really changed person. And that I could go on a lot about that, but that's certainly not why we're here.
So let me just ask a follow-up question. It's probably the next to last question. But people would say, okay, fine, but I don't have to try to convince you that Arabs in the 7th century had great memory abilities, because I can point to today in 2023, when we're recording, young Muslim children who memorize the Quran and recite it completely orally. And, there are ceremonies in different Islamic cultures where this is celebrated, etc. So doesn't that show that people could remember verbatim what the Quran, how it was originally proclaimed, and even if it were 10 years later, still recorded that precisely?
Fantastic question, one that is answered in the chapter on memory science, with all the necessary documentation to send you to the places where you can see the basis for my answer. Verbatim memory of a text is only possible in a literate culture. This is what the specialists on memory science have found. What has been repeatedly shown to be true is that verbatim recall of a text, more than 50 words, in the absence of a written text, has never been done. That's what the memory scientists said. So once you have a written Quran, you can do that. And part of why you can do that is because when you get it wrong, you can go back to that and you can fix it. And you can keep fixing it until you've got it. But until you've got that thing you can keep going back to, it's going to change.
Well, this was awesome. There's a lot of other things I wanted to get to that we didn't get to, which will be the way that I start the email to you when I invite you for another episode. But in the meanwhile, last question, how can people stay in touch with your work? Just stay up to date with the things you're working on.
That's a good question. I try to post things on Academia EDU once I think they've been out long enough. And I have my own webpage. You can always track me down through Stephen-Shoemaker.com and see what I'm up to. It's not, not as up to date as maybe it should be, but you can email me if you want. I always say everyone who emails me gets one response. If you get a second response, it depends. It depends on how interesting your response to my response was. I get a lot of email. People want me to explain things to them, and just depending on the conversation, you may or may not get a longer response from me. But generally, if you have a quick question about something, I usually to give you a prompt and quick response. So I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on the gram. I hate those things. I think they're pernicious to society. I wish they would all go away.
Okay. Well, Professor Stephen Shoemaker, thank you so much for being on Exploring the Quran and the Bible.
Thanks for having me on. I hope I wasn't too punchy.
Well, friends, thanks for being with us for this episode of Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I hope you found it to be an edifying discussion. I really hope that you find generally the the content on this channel to be useful. There's a really diverse range of things in regard to Quranic studies and biblical studies with top-notch scholars. And we'll be really grateful for your support. So please don't hesitate to like the videos, starting with this one maybe, to subscribe to the channel and to share the news with your friends about exploring the Quran and the Bible.